Okay, well, it is now 10 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Aaron Blumberg, Swiftland's Continuing Education Coordinator. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's webinar, I is for Inclusivity in Workplace Culture. We have a wonderful learning opportunity ready for you this morning with Dr. Bob Bidding. Dr. Bidding is a professor and administrator at Alfred University and is an independent leadership and organizational development consultant and trainer. He is also a licensed mental health counselor and is nationally certified as a domestic violence instructor through Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. He directs and is the group co-facilitator for the Batterers Education Program for Domestic Violence Offenders in Allegheny County, New York, through the District Attorney's Office. Please welcome Dr. Bidding and enjoy his webinar this morning. Dr. Bidding?
Okay, thank you. Thanks to Luli and to Aaron for setting this up this morning, and especially to Aaron, who helped me with all the technical stuff that I'm not very good at. So good morning to everybody, and happy to talk to you today about this particular topic. It's a beautiful day. I'm in downtown Brooklyn on business, and actually I'm looking out my window right now at the Brooklyn Bridge. So it's a pretty nice day to be in New York City. I hope the weather's good for you folks too down there. So what I want to really talk to you about today is the idea of building inclusive workplaces in terms of culture and diversity. And the title of my screen there, you'll see, is how can we do better? Because I think that no matter how good we think we're doing now, there's always room for improvement. And certainly in terms of national news in our country and the things that have been going on in the past month or two, I hope you will agree that this is a pretty timely topic. So what I'd like to do is ask you to please, if you have questions as we go through this, just enter them into the chat box, and I'll try to answer them as we go along. So you don't really have to hold your questions to the end if you don't want to. Just let me know, and I'll try to go through this at a good pace. If I'm going too quickly, let me know, and we'll go from there. So, good morning. I want to talk about inclusion a little bit and how it fits into the idea of your cultural worldview. And I use the idea of worldview because, to me, the idea of culture is a very individual thing, that each of us, because of our background, experiences, where we were born, when we were born, how we were raised, each of us has our own individual cultural worldview. And we are certainly diverse, and in many ways, we're in many different ways that we don't often think about, both in terms of being similar as well as being different. And I think that's an important point to remember, that a lot of times when we're thinking about how we're interacting with other people, that oftentimes we focus on what's different about us as opposed to really appreciating what's similar. And how can you take that diversity and harness it in terms of a happy and productive workplace? And I think this is an interesting one too. I think that asking people about are they biased, are they prejudiced? Most people would say I try pretty hard not to be biased and prejudicial in my dealings with others. And in fact, when we see somebody acting in a prejudicial way, those things are pretty obvious to us, and we try to avoid those things at all costs. But sometimes, again, just because of our own worldview, we say and do things that we might not even be aware of that might be offensive to another person. And I ask people all the time if they think they're decent and fair-minded people, and most of us would raise our hands and say, yes, that's me. So the idea is to think about our day-to-day interactions and the maybe subtle and even types of slights that we might be unaware of, and think about how we can do better when we're interacting with other people. And focusing a little bit on this idea of inclusion and what does that mean to you. So I hope as we go through this, you're thinking about this in terms of your interactions with one another, in the workplace, but also outside of the workplace. What does inclusion mean to you? And I hope one of the things that I hope happens after this morning's webinar is that you take some of the things that we talk about and continue the conversation. We have a short time together this morning, but I hope I give you a little bit of information that will allow you to continue to talk about this. Because sometimes I think there's a real reluctance to get into that topic because it's sensitive. So we I just read an interesting book called Willful Blindness that sort of suggests that a lot of times we sort of ignore things because it's a little bit uncomfortable to deal with them outright. So here's my definition of inclusion, and actually I got this from a couple different places. But inclusion is the process of valuing all individuals and leveraging their diverse talent, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. And that gets back to the point I made a slide or two ago, that instead of focusing on what's different about us, a good way to think about inclusion is to think about what we have in common and what's similar about us. And these are things sometimes that are easily seen in terms of understanding what we have in common, but sometimes you have to really dig deep to find out that you have common experiences, backgrounds, interests, etc. And it doesn't just happen by hanging out. I mean, it really requires a conscious effort, ongoing basis to involve everyone around you in the workplace and think about gifts. I call it gifts differing, that we all have certain gifts that we can bring to the workplace, but they're different, and each of us has a set of talents and skills and abilities that we can bring to the workplace. And how do you bring that out on a day-to-day basis? And these are sort of big picture goals. Why is this important? I think why is it so important to think about inclusion? Here are a few things that I gathered, some of the facts. Pretty interesting that by 2042 there's going to be no single demographic majority, and people of color will comprise more than 50% of the U.S. population. By 2050, 1 in 5 people living in the United States will be Hispanic. There are a lot of generations in the workplace. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but you have our older population, the group that the traditionalists, they're called, that are sort of aging out of the workforce. Then you have people like me, aging baby boomers, and and so forth, down to the newest people that are entering the workplace. They're called millennials or nexters, etc. What's interesting for the workplace is, of course, that people are working longer. They're staying in the workforce mix longer, which means you have a greater variety, a greater diversity in terms of age workers in the workplace. Disabilities affect 20% of all Americans. How does your workplace accommodate disabilities on a day-to-day basis? Women continue to earn the majority of college degrees in the United States. An estimated 9 million LGBT individuals in the United States. This is a good thing to think about too, that 1 in 5 workers have experienced discrimination or unfair treatment at work. And a lot of the employees who experience discrimination will stay, but when you lose people, there's a financial cost to it. It costs a lot of money to replace someone who's left. And again, inclusive organizations have the highest employee engagement, which in turn leads to higher performance and productivity. There's a really good book about that talks about workplace satisfaction, and I think I probably mentioned this to you if you've met me before. But Malcolm Gladwell has a great book called Blink, and he also has a really good book called Outliers that talks about workplace satisfaction and the types of things that contribute to workplace satisfaction. And some of this information came from the census. Uh, I found this slide and I thought it was pretty interesting in terms of a historical perspective of where we are in terms of inclusion. And what strikes me as I look at this particular slide is, we haven't really been at it that long, at least as a focused workplace topic and a focused workplace effort. It really started in the 60s and with when Lyndon Johnson was president, civil rights movement, and moved through not only as a social movement but a political movement. And so we're still really in the middle of this learning curve in terms of what inclusion means, from just assimilating people into society to an appreciation of multiculturalism and to really translating that into action, because I think really inclusion has to do with translating diversity and culture into action, and that's why it says process and performance underneath the word inclusive. And I think most organizations are still, thinking about and doing things having to do with just understanding and managing diversity, and still have a ways to go in terms of making the workplace truly inclusive. Just pausing for a moment there so you can take a look at that. But this, I really like this particular slide in terms of historical perspective. So, I mean, diversity means lots of things, and, we could talk about all the things on this particular slide for a long time, but again, I think the point of this is just to show you that you can think about diversity in a lot of different ways, that diversity doesn't just have to do with race or ethnicity or the color of somebody's skin. It really has to do with a lot of things having to do with physical abilities and characteristics, sexuality, the way we communicate with each other, the way our families are, where we live, and what kind of experiences we've had. And so it's a very rich opportunity to look in terms of looking for ways to involve people and bring out the best of people in the workplace. But it's oftentimes hard to see past our own worldview. So one of the things you can think of when you look at this particular slide is, how would you describe yourself in terms of some of these descriptors on the page? How would you describe yourself in terms of age, race, ethnicity, income, etc.? There's different dimensions of inclusion. I'd like to just say a couple words about them. What does it really mean when you're talking about inclusion? What types of variables do you need to think of? How are the rules and procedures in your organization? Do they address issues of fairness in employment practices? This is oftentimes where you'll see this. Most organizations have something to do with employment practices and what's fair in terms of rules and procedures. Also, I mean, your organization should have in place policies and procedures having to do with performance evaluations. What do those look like? How do they account for differences between and among people? And then it begins to be a little more fuzzy. A lot of times organizations will have policies and procedures in place, but when it comes to thinking about how people are involved in decision making, what do you see happening there? And oftentimes these are informal rules, and organizations don't actually have anything written about this. So it's something sometimes organizations talk about as being important, but oftentimes fall short in terms of actual actions they might be taking. Again, inclusive management and leadership. How many women are in leadership roles in a particular organization? How many minorities are in leadership roles in terms of management and leadership? And oftentimes, and in many organizations, it's skewed towards middle-aged white people, and so how do you think about that? What do you see in your workplace, and how do people move through the organization and advance, and go up the ladder in terms of leadership and management. I think that's a very interesting thing to look at. Been doing some work for a large bank in Pennsylvania, and working with different levels of employees. And when I did some work for the leadership group, most of the leaders in the bank were, again, white, middle-aged males. I think there was one female, one person of color, and a good organization doing good things for people, but maybe a need to re-examine some of their leadership and succession training. How well do we communicate with one another? How open is your organization in terms of open access? How do you look to integrate differences in your workforce? And this is a lot to consider, both formal and informal ideas of inclusion, and sort of walking the talk. I mean, talking about it's one thing, putting it in policies and procedures is another thing, but actually seeing it in practice is really where I see the challenge with all of this stuff, right? And again, getting back to understanding a little bit about your worldview. I'm just pausing here for a second. If anyone has any questions, type them in, and be happy to talk about some of this stuff. Okay. So I think the question you want to ask yourself, really, when you look around you in the workplace, do you see diversity and culture as an opportunity to create a beautiful kaleidoscope, or do you see it as a point where people where it generates conflict? So this is the idea of kaleidoscope versus kaleidoscope. What do you see in your workplace right now? How would you describe what's going on there? How people are getting along, and how does that reflect people's worldview and the variety of cultures that are present? So let's just talk about culture for just 1 minute, because culture really is what is behind this whole idea of inclusion. Because I guess if all of our cultures were exactly alike, inclusion would be less of a problem. But culture is really, everything that happens to us that we've learned since we were born, right? So culture is the acquired knowledge people use to interpret experience and generate behavior. And some of you may be familiar with this idea of the iceberg metaphor as it has to do with culture. I think this is a really interesting way to think about culture, not only your culture, but the culture of someone sitting next to you. And this is sort of what it looks like, the cultural iceberg. And what this says really is that, there's part of our culture, our individual cultures, that can be seen by ourselves and by others, and that are easy to sort of understand a little bit. Let me give you an example of sort of an observable behavior, above the waves. And of course, the iceberg metaphor also has to do with the fact that 10% of us is seen and knowable to other people, but there's a lot of us below the waterline, that's less obvious and less apparent. And this is where you have to sort of, I think, dig deep sometimes to find the similarities that you might have with other people. But let me give you a couple examples of observable behavior. It might be very easy if you get to know me to know what my music tastes are. That's something that's observable. And if you know me for more than 10 minutes, you'll know that I'm a big Beatles fan. And I love everything about the Beatles and things like that. Well, that's seeable because you know me a little bit. You might also notice, how I dress on a daily basis. That's pretty obvious to see, and that might be reflective of my culture. If I invite you over to my house, you'll get to see how my house is decorated, the decor of my house. That's something you can see that tells you a little bit about me. Maybe what I like to eat when I go out to dinner is another observable behavior that gives you a sense of who I am. Or just language and expressions that I use that might give you some indication of who I am and what my culture and background is. And I think those things are pretty interesting. But what's harder to see is the stuff that's below the waterline that just occasionally comes to the surface. And this applies not only to what other people see about you, it also applies to how you think about yourself. And if you've ever been surprised, for example, by an emotion that you've had and thought, well, where did that come from? That's maybe an element of your deep culture surfacing for a minute that you have to think about. So when I went to one of the recent Star Trek movies with my son, Mike, and all of a sudden in the middle of the movie, for those of you who are Star Trek fans, where you see Captain Kirk seeing the USS Enterprise for the first time, well, all of a sudden my son looks at me in the movie, and I've got a tear coming down my cheek, and my son said, "You're not crying, are you?" And I said, "Oh, wow, I guess I am." But I was just excited to know that that was the first time that Captain Kirk saw the Enterprise, and they were going to be going off on these space adventures, and that's something that as a kid, many years ago in the 60s when Star Trek was out, that sort of became part of my cognitive and emotional person. And it surprised me when I had that reaction, but then it allowed me to reflect a little bit on where did that come from, why was that part of me, and why did I have that sort of emotional or cognitive reaction to that. So a lot of things are hidden below the waterline, including things from ourselves. And if those things are hidden from ourselves, imagine how it is in terms of interacting with other people too. So other examples of that stuff below the waterline that you might not see right away is what's your conception of what's beautiful? How do you behave towards people who are ethnically or racially different than you? What's your initial reaction when you see somebody different than you? How about just what you think about in terms of leisure activities? That's sort of below the waterline. Or attitudes that you might have on dating for your teenagers, or dating in your family, or how about just how you parent, parenting skills, those types of things develop in ways that oftentimes we don't think about, but those are things that are a little more hidden and harder to see. Anyway, any questions on the cultural iceberg? I think it's an interesting way to think about who we are and where things come from. All right. I'll give you one more quick example. One more quick example, then I'll move on. I have a grandson now, and very excited about that. Try to see him as much as possible. And of course, guess what? He already likes Beatles music. I wonder how that happened. And he also likes to watch the blast off of the rocket in Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks. And every time that rocket blasts off to head for the moon, I have a very emotional reaction to that. Well, again, why is that? Because I remember quite vividly the period in the 60s when we were involved in the space program. And as a kid, that was really exciting to me. And, that's become part of my sort of worldview and culture. Anyway, interesting to think about, and how these things get passed down generationally also. All right, so is that all there is to it? Understanding culture and diversity is one thing. I'm getting a couple comments about, yes, loving Captain Kirk, and Tony, you mentioned, I think that's why most assumptions we make are based on what we see. Yeah, we see things, and we have assumptions, and those assumptions really are grounded in our prior experiences, whatever those are. And again, we have to make a lot of decisions and do a lot of things on a daily basis, so we do make a lot of assumptions. Hopefully, many times we're right, but of course, with assumptions, you know what they say about the word assumption, so I won't go into that. But a lot of times we're wrong, and that's where there's an opportunity to learn and move forward. Anyway, the idea of inclusion translating diversity and culture into action. So what's the research show? These are a couple things. One from the Diversity Research Network, that workforce diversity is positively associated with higher business performance outcomes. Racial diversity is positively associated with higher performance in organizations. Gender diversity is positively associated with more effective group processes. All right, the idea of people-oriented performance. And a couple more facts from the Center for Creative Leadership, that teams that are diverse are more creative and perform better in problem solving than homogeneous teams. That makes sense because people who all think alike and act alike are going to sort of all buy into the same type of protocols and actions, and maybe even get along better. But they're missing an opportunity, and that opportunity is, the differing viewpoints and the other creative ideas that come from people that are different than us. So actually, diversity contributes to better processes and better decision making. And this says a lot in one bullet, but the effects of diversity are highly dependent on the presence of facilitating or inhibiting conditions in the organization. In other words, is this something that's encouraged, or is this something that's stifled in terms of creativity and accepting different viewpoints and different ideas during the decision-making process? So, diversity without inclusion won't work. So you can talk about diversity all you want in your workplace and define it however you want, statistically, numbers of this versus numbers of that. But inclusion, as you see, I know it's a noun, but to me inclusion is that idea of that's where the action is. So it's really the verb in all of this mix. And it's complicated, right? These are things that happen in an organization and things that are related to the idea of an inclusive environment. And I won't talk about all of them, but these are different areas where there's room to work on things. How do you encourage your employees to have a work and a life balance? That's something that's been interesting to me in terms of career development and life planning. How do you provide opportunities to continually learn new things? How do you hook up new employees with people who can help them in terms of mentoring and coaching? And just been doing a lot of work on recently on the idea of leadership and toxic leadership. So that's another very interesting area that you can look at in terms of what type of leadership do you have in the organizations. All of these things work together to create an inclusive environment. But of course, the opposite's true also, that dysfunction in any of these areas can also make it much more difficult to have an inclusive environment. So, thinking about the organization where you're in right now, and what kind of sort of a management model do you have? Traditionally, many organizations sort of had a bureaucratic model, right? Hierarchical, chain of command. You only need to know what you need to know, and a lot of emphasis on the leader or leaders of the organization making things happen. That's that idea of heroic leadership and accountability, and it comes from this. It comes from Maslow's hierarchy. Many of you are familiar with this. That what we do is as we go through our days is to feel safe, feel productive, feel loved. Seek self-actualization, all that stuff. But this model sort of is the historic leadership model, that very few people get to the top of Maslow's hierarchy in terms of empowered leadership. So there's a real tendency to want to count on that person or persons to really be the driving force in an organization. Of course, what we're learning now is that leadership is really the idea of mutually influencing one another and really should sort of bubble up through the organization and then bubble down too. And let me show you a little bit about that. This is sort of the desired end state in a lot of organizations now, and a lot of organizations are sort of pushing for this, the idea of more flattened organizational structure, getting everyone to sort of participate, look for opportunities to innovate and bring creativity forward, and more of a divergent thinking and decision-making process. And then the bottom, the idea of shared leadership and accountability. So the challenge is, to sort of flip the pyramid. And you'll see that if I go back real quick to this one, you'll see that this is all driven toward the top, the traditional hierarchical one. It's really just a one-way street in terms of power influence. And if you look at the flipped pyramid, you'll see the arrow there near power and influence really pointing in both directions, that everyone should have an opportunity to be involved in the decision-making process and in the leadership process of the organization. I also sort of like, this is another slide that I found that I really like. What does cultural competence mean to you, and where are you on the continuum? I think this is really an interesting continuum to look at and to ask yourself, where do you think your organization is on that continuum? Now, most of us, I would say, hopefully are in the area of at least cultural pre-competence, which means that, employees, that you're actively trying to explore cultural issues, you're committed to the idea of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and maybe you've done some specific things to assess what it is the organization needs to do. And that's why I sort of highlighted that one in blue letters, because I think that's where a lot of organizations are. And then once you reach a pre-competence level, maybe you can move into sort of the higher levels on the continuum, which is not only recognizing cultural differences and getting advice from diverse groups, but also really implementing substantive changes that respond to the cultural needs of your workforce. All right. Any questions about this one? What's interesting to think about it, have you ever worked at an organization at any time during your careers that really was back down toward the negative end of this continuum, where where people were sort of forced to be together? There was obviously bias taking place in the workplace. Have you ever experienced racism in the workplace? Most of us have seen it from time to time. So, and a lot of times I think we move in and out of organizations. I think there's a natural tendency to want to work in organizations that are further along toward the positive end of this continuum. Any comments on this particular slide? I like this one. All right. So, these are some things that are interesting to think about doing. I wanted to give you one thing that I thought you could try after we're done today. There's something called the Harvard Bias Impact Analysis Test. If you go online and just type Harvard Bias Impact Analysis Test, it'll send you to a link where you can actually do a personal analysis of your own biases. And again, sometimes you don't even know you have a bias until you do something like this. It's a pretty interesting test that you can take, and give you some things to talk about and to think about. How well do you keep yourself open to new untested ideas and consider alternatives? People don't like to change. It's hard to get them to do new things. And, especially flipping that pyramid that I showed you a little while ago, power and accountability need to sort of flow both ways and in the organization. And the idea of sharing power doesn't equal abdicating responsibility. It's interesting that a lot of times organizations that aren't functioning effectively are because of a leader who is overly concerned with power and control. It's actually the same dynamic you see when you work with domestic violence offenders. It's all about power and control. And the idea of sharing power, doesn't mean that you're abdicating responsibility. Sharing power is a much more effective way to manage. And, how do you design your day-to-day activities in terms of yielding ideas to solutions more than one? How do you create interdisciplinary teams and encourage divergent thinking? And, how do you deconstruct some of the silos that happen in the workplace, as groups of people tend to be attracted to and want to work with people who are just like them? That's often a challenge. And, creative tension's okay, as long as it's constructive. Conflict can be very constructive as well as destructive. And then aligning your policies and procedures, accordingly. A couple other things I think are sort of interesting. These are some good vocabulary words you can throw around and impress your friends. Autoplasty versus alloplasty, because I think really this is one of the key things when you're thinking about what workplace inclusion means to you. Autoplasty is, what is it that we expect? How do we expect people to change when they come into our workplace? All right, and how much change is appropriate, because each workplace, just like each individual, has its own culture. And so when someone comes into a workplace, it takes them a little while to adapt to this new environment they're in. And, that's expected. I mean, I expect that if I go to work for a new organization, I'm going to have to sort of learn what the culture's like when I'm there, and I'm going to have to probably adapt a little bit. And that's okay. And how much should the environment itself change to promote, to adjust to a culturally different person? So when I come into the workplace, I should expect to have to change a little bit because it's a different place. But I also hope that when I work in this new place, that the culture there has room for what I bring to the table too. So I think this is really the tension, autoplasty versus alloplasty, that you see in most organizations. I went and visited a public school not too long ago down here in New York, and what struck me when I walked in the door to go visit one of our counseling students there was that they were having a parents' night. And there was a sign, there was a big sign in the hallway near the principal's office announcing Parents' Night, and the sign was written in 7 different languages. So here's an example of a school that's taken a lot of time and effort to adjust itself, to change the environment to accommodate a variety of different students that are in the school. And that to me is sort of an example of autoplasty versus alloplasty. The other extreme there, you have a school that is so accommodating, the other extreme is comments that you might hear like, well, if you're gonna work here, you've got to be like this. Or if you're going to be, if you're going to work and live in America, you better speak English. Those types of sort of extreme comments that also reflect this idea of autoplasty and alloplasty. In this case, very intolerant, very unwilling to make a change in the environment. And again, some of these things are hard to talk about. I hope everyone's okay out there. I can't see you to see if you're sleeping or how you're doing. Another sort of way to think about the idea of inclusion and balance is the idea of emic versus edic. This, again, just sort of a concept that I thought might be interesting to the group. But emics are really ideas and behaviors and items that are culture specific. So they might have to do with you and the things that you're interested in. I tell people all the time, one of the examples I use is the idea of deer hunting. That's sort of part of my family's culture, and it's something that I get excited about because every November my son comes home and we go out into the woods and dress in camouflage and and go hunting. But as I get excited about that, I have to realize that not everyone might be getting excited about that. In fact, some people might find it upsetting and wish that I quit talking about it because it's really something that they think is not a good thing to be doing. So thinking about that and being sensitive to sort of your cultural viewpoint versus the viewpoint of somebody else, and that's sort of what this is all about. So emics have to do with things that are specific to you, and edicts are ideas and behaviors and things that are more cultural, general, or universal. In other words, things that might be taking place in your workplace. And let me give you an example of that. So edict is frequently used to describe the prevailing or dominant culture to which a culturally different person must adapt. Again, using the workplace as an example. So the way to think about the idea of inclusion and this idea of edict and emic is to really think about it in terms of your day-to-day interactions in the workplace. Think about it. I tell people to think about it in terms of looking through two sets of glasses. In other words, you need an emic pair of glasses that I think we all need to work on the idea of being empathetic with our coworkers' cultural worldviews. All right, and empathy is a hard thing to do, but empathy really means the idea of really trying to understand the other person from his or her point of view or worldview. All right, and empathy is a great thing. It's something that we should all strive for. But I remind people all the time that you can never be 100% empathetic with someone else because you're not someone else. You're you. All right, and so the idea of actively, mindfully, which really means paying attention on purpose and trying to suspend judgment, the idea of being non-judgmental has to do with this idea of using your emic pair of glasses. And of course, the tough thing about that is whenever we interact with someone, especially the first time, we immediately drop, some sort of a judgment on top of that person or put them in some sort of a stereotypical category because, that makes it easier for us to handle. To take the time to be more empathetic and more mindful and to suspend judgment really takes a lot of work. So not only do you need this emic pair of glasses, you need an edic pair too. So you're trying hard to understand someone else's worldview, but at the same time, and I think this is one that we don't think about as much, we don't understand sometimes how our own cultural worldview and demand affects others around us, right? Because we are who we are, and we think the way that we think, and sometimes we forget what kind of an impact that has on the person next to us. Let's see. Tony makes the point, yeah, really, you never really understand a coworker's taking time off for sick kids until you had a child yourself. Exactly. That's a good example of this idea of edic and emic, really, until you look at it through those set of spectacles, now maybe a little more sympathetic or empathetic to people who need to take time off for sick kids. Good remark. So, in terms of edic and emic, what's the balance? What's the balance? It's one thing to expose our values to other people because that's who we are, but I think there's always a balance in terms of exposing who we are values-wise versus, imposing our values. And again, just using that example of deer hunting, deer hunting's great if you like it, but, I shouldn't try to force my values on someone else who doesn't think hunting is such a good idea. And the idea that it's okay for me to expose the fact that I like to do something or I have this particular thing, but to understand that what's right for me isn't necessarily right for someone else. And you get it right, and this is what you're looking for. That there's really an opportunity. It's a really undertapped resource that most organizations could take better advantage of. The idea of high performance teams, and it sort of starts with this idea of inclusion and diversity, and that idea of equity really anchoring the continuum. So I want to spend the next just few minutes with sort of a homework assignment, and then see if you have any questions. This is a really interesting way that I thought you could continue the discussion after we're done with the webinar this morning. The idea of cultural autobiography. I think this is an interesting way, if you remember the iceberg metaphor. This is a very interesting way to reflect on sort of who you are, and what part of the pyramid do you see, what parts above the waterline, and maybe getting at some of the parts of the iceberg that are below the surface, that are hidden more deeply in terms of our cognitive and emotional selves. So here's some good questions to get you started. What's your cultural autobiography? So, again, depending on how you like to bring your staffs together and talk about these things, these questions can generate quite a good discussion in terms of getting people to think about things, and realizing, again, the idea of, what do you have in similar, not, in common, and being similar as opposed to being different. So what's your name, birth date, and place of birth? One of the interesting things that if you think about names is that names are never given lightly, and many of us are named for somebody, or there's a reason why my name's Bob, and that's because I had an uncle that I never knew who died during World War II, and of course that was a very traumatic event for my grandparents and my father and uncle, and then my other uncle. So that when I was born, I was the first male born of that next generation. I was given my dead uncle's name, and there was a reason for that, and that's really embedded in my family history and culture. And as I've learned more about my Uncle Bob and what type of a person he was and the things he did, that has a big impact on my own worldview. So, just who you were named at can be a very interesting part of your worldview. When were you born? Where were you born? How would you describe your own cultural or national heritage? How would you answer that question? I think a lot of these questions we might think about occasionally, but sitting down and really giving it some specific thought, I think, can be a very interesting thing. What's your cultural national heritage? How about the cultural mix of the schools that you attended? Can you think about where you went to school and what type of other kids were in the schools that you attended? How about the cultural mix of the religious institutions you attended or attend? Again, these don't have to be past tense. Another way to think about your cultural autobiography. How about the cultural mix of the neighborhood where you grew up? Again, you talk about, a lot of these have past tenses to them because, again, our worldview is created as we grow up, and especially through our formative years. It reminds me of sort of the idea of imprinting, with it. If you, when baby chicks are hatched, if you put them in front of a cat instead of a dog, they'll think the cat or the dog are their mother. It's not quite that simple in terms of adult behavior, but certainly things that happen to us when we're younger oftentimes are very impactful as we grow up and are adults. All right, and that's why I remember where I was on February of 1964 when I was 9 years old, when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show. That was a big deal to me, and as you know already, because I've already mentioned it a couple times, that becomes part of my culture. All right, so So these are some of the questions. I have a few more. How about trips abroad? What trips abroad have you taken? That expands sort of your cultural worldview. What foreign languages do you speak, read, or write? It's interesting as I work with graduate students down here in New York City, especially, and most of our graduate students down here are working adults. Probably the median age is about 40, and very, very diverse group. And many of our students speak and write 2 or 3 different languages. Well, heck, I'm very jealous of that. I speak one language and sometimes not very well, and to work with people who speak a number of languages, that's pretty interesting stuff. How about the cultural mix of your workplace right now? So this sort of brings it back to what we've been talking about today. How would you describe the cultural mix of your workplace? Do you talk about it? How do you see it reflected in people's behaviors and actions and conversations that take place? Or is it one of those things that you don't talk about? Again, some of this stuff really gets interesting when you start to talk about it. But you should look at it as a real opportunity to increase the richness of your workplace. So, what is the cultural mix of your workplace? And what's interesting here, of course, is not just how you would describe it, but how about the person next to you? How would they describe it? What you'll find is that oftentimes people's perceptions of the cultural mix in a particular workplace are different. And I think that's a conversation worth having. That's really a conversation worth having. And this one, I like this one, I like all these questions actually, but do you ever participate in social or recreational activities with people who are racially or culturally different than you? The work day's over, you go home, how do you see diversity and inclusion in your personal lives as well as your professional lives? Have you ever worked around people in the military or the civilian sector who were different racially, culturally, or both? How about, have you ever had racially or culturally different teachers, professors, or both? And then the last set of questions to get you thinking, the idea is, do you now or have you ever taught, supervised, or otherwise been in charge of racially or culturally different people? And how's that working for you? Or how has it worked for you? Has it been a challenge? Have you brought, stereotypes and prejudices into your working relationship with other people? And, how do you feel around people who are racially or culturally different from you? If someone answers this question, just fine, there's no difference between dealing with this person or that person, I think most people are not telling the truth there because, I think we do have different feelings. And, what do you do with those feelings, when you have them? How do you look at them as an opportunity to create something new and exciting and improve a relationship? Or do you use it as a way to sort of dismiss and minimize that other person or persons? Have you ever had any academic courses that are related to racial or cultural differences? A great way to learn about this stuff is to actually, read about it, get involved in some sort of a formal or informal educational setting where you can share opinions and ideas and learn about some of these things. And, what other experiences you had that would help a person understand your level of exposure to racial or cultural differences. In terms of a spouse, an intimate friend who is racially or culturally different. So interesting to think about, again, maybe your family relationships and your friend relationships. How do you see it reflected there? And this one is interesting. I just sort of added it, but that idea of what type of climate do you feel most comfortable residing in? that can have a lot to do with your cultural autobiography too. So, you know, example I like to use is my son, who for a couple of years had to work in St. Croix. Now that's a Caribbean island, and it sounds like a wonderful place. We went and visited him a couple times. But after a while, I would ask him, how's it going down there today? What's the weather like? And he'd say, well, it's sunny. It's sunny and 80 degrees. And I'd call him again and say, what's the weather like? He said, oh, it's sunny and 80 degrees. And after a while, it was like, he had enough of it being sunny and 80 degrees. He wanted to come back north where the seasons change, and he could do the things he likes to do. And so sometimes, who we are in terms of where we're comfortable has to do with where we were born and raised, maybe. So that's another thing. I also ask people, when they're thinking of changing jobs, if I offered you $150,000 for a job, most people would say that sounds good. But then I ask them, would they like to work in Alaska for a year, or work in Alaska and only be able to bring one of their family members with them? So that idea of type of climate is interesting too. And climate can mean geographic area as well as the people that are around you. So the idea of inclusion, really remember, it all starts and ends with your worldview, your basic belief system, and that there's a real opportunity. If you share your worldview, if you think about it, if you're a little bit introspective, that building a more inclusive workplace is something that's good and productive and can make us very happy. And so sort of the challenge is, as I wrap up here, is to ask yourself, what's one thing, one action, specific action that you could take in the next 24 hours that would help you to either appreciate, understand, or develop a more inclusive workplace. What's one specific thing you can do? And if that's a conversation you can have with the people that are sitting around you right now as we get through this particular presentation, I think that's an interesting conversation to have. What's one thing that you could do better? What's one specific thing? So let me see where I am. How about questions or comments? I thought I would take just about an hour and then leave a few minutes for questions.